imagined these readers maybe being able to take a slim little book, a slim green book, out of their pack while they were walking and just find some solace and find some inspiration and find some company in the stories of historical girls, women of the past, who spent time outdoors and welcomed the outdoors in, or else met their own fiercer selves in an outdoors that was challenging and thereby changed their lives.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society in partnership with GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors NEHGS and the producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at the lives of some of this country's most impactful women and their interaction with the natural world, play, and sports. On your screen is the schedule for our hour and 15-minute event centered on the book Wild Girl by Tiya Miles. The author will talk to us for approximately 20 minutes and share several great images. After that, she'll be in conversation with tonight's moderator, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Then Professor Ulrich will pose some of your questions. We're a nice group tonight, and we're eager to hear from you. Tonight's program is being produced and recorded by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be sent to you in the next 24 hours, made especially for many of you paid participants who could not attend tonight but wanted to partake, and those of you who may have had some technical difficulty. Let's hope not, but if it happens, there is a recording. Soon, GBH Forum Network will get to work producing their version of the same video that they will release to the public in 2024. Now, moving to introductions, Tiya Miles is the Michael Garvey Professor of History at Harvard University, the author of 5 prize-winning works in the history of slavery and early American race relations, and a 2011 MacArthur Fellowship recipient. She was the founder and director of the Michigan-based Echo Girls program, and she is the author of the National Book Award-winning New York Times best-selling book, All That She Carried. I am equally honored to be presenting tonight and to be introducing our moderator, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. She is the 30th anniversary University Professor Emerita at Harvard University, the author of 7 books, including A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, 1785 to 1812, and Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History, exploring the popular phrase which she coined. She's received numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1991. Professor Ulrich will join us for the second half of the program, but to start us off, welcome to you, Professor Miles. It is such an honor to have you with us. We are really glad to be able to travel with you through history and into the natural world. The New York Times called Wild Girls just earlier this week a beautiful synthesis of diverse women's experiences, combining history and memoir and a call to action. I have to say, I love the book, and I was really glad to see that even in 19th century America, women were resisting our country's confining gender roles, as the New York Times called it. So I really thank you for introducing us to these women that you're going to talk about, and many others. You've so beautifully and lyrically profiled. Thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, for having me here. I'm incredibly excited to be here with you and with those of us who are joining us in the virtual space. This is my first event since the book came out, and I couldn't be more delighted. I have to start with just a personal comment about Professor Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And this may go on a little bit, as I have a tendency to do when I tell stories about her. I don't know if you all noticed, but I was just beaming as the books were being listed and her career was being described, because Laurel Thatcher Ulrich was my model historian when I was in graduate school. When I read A Midwife's Tale, I was completely knocked off my feet. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was so intricate, so insightful, so beautiful. So I haven't come close to it in my work, but I'm gonna keep striving. I'm really, really so grateful to Professor Ulrich for being here with me and with all of us this evening. I think I'll probably have to tell a couple more stories as I wrap up my comments and hand it over to her for Q&A. But for now, I want to say that that famous quote by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, "Well-behaved women seldom make history," is available in many forms. I have the bumper sticker on my campus office door. And I only realized when preparing for this conversation here tonight that her famous saying applies perfectly to the spirit and to the argument of my new book, Wild Girls, because the girls who become women, as I trace them over the course of this book, prove Professor Ulrich's point. These are girls who are not well behaved in the understanding and expectation of their cultural context, and these are women who made history in part because of their willingness to push against those cultural and societal dictates. So I've been thinking of this book as a little book about girls who dreamed big outdoors, because this is a short and sweet, with a little bit of sharpness at times, set of portraits about a number of girls across various geographical locations in the United States and in indigenous territories that were colonized by the United States, who spent hours of their lives outside. And the main argument of the book is fairly straightforward, though I have to admit it took me a little while of collecting these stories and thinking about them to realize that this was the main argument. And that is that many of the girls who became women, whose contributions we remember today for being innovative and brave and powerful and radical, spent a fair amount of their childhoods outside. They spent a fair amount of their childhood days in relationship with nature, observing the natural world, observing and interpreting the social world that was, of course, unfolding on the landscapes around them. And the time they spent outdoors changed them such that they were able to ask questions that they couldn't ask in quite the same way within enclosed domestic spaces. They were able to hone their skills. They were able to test their ideas. They were able to think new thoughts that weren't permissible or that weren't invited in the various enclosed contexts in which they were spending most of their lives. And that these questions and ideas and thoughts and all this internal testing helps them to become stronger, bolder, and braver the next time around. So to arrive at this main argument for Wild Girls, what I did was go back to many of the women whom I had studied previously for parts of books or for academic journal articles or for preparing my lectures for my classes. And I was going back to look for women for whom I had an inkling that there was an outdoor or an outside facet to their history that I may have overlooked before. And the first person who came to mind as I was doing this exercise was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is a very important person in the book, and she's the person whose experience, environmental awareness, ecological consciousness really jumped out at me. We, of course, know about Tubman for the many trips that she made back to the South after freeing herself from enslavement. And one of the things I thought about when conceiving this book was the way in which Tubman did most of that incredibly thoughtful work outside. Once I saw Tubman in that way and then rolled back the clock to think about how her girlhood might have affected that, I started seeing this in other women, such as, next slide, Harriet Jacobs, who was also an enslaved girl who became a woman about whom we know quite a lot about, because she ended up writing a narrative, a memoir of her life, which has become very important to telling us about the experiences of enslaved girls and women. And Harriet Jacobs also became an important abolitionist, anti-slavery organizer, and community organizer during and after the Civil War. And once the ball was rolling, I thought of people like Louisa May Alcott. Alcott is not someone I had written about before, but she is someone I had taught about before in a class that I designed with the support of the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe that focused on abolitionist women. And I had actually recently reread Little Women, which I had first read as a teen. Happy to talk about that experience later, or the contrast, if you'd like, in the Q&A. And I actually took my family over to Orchard House during the pandemic when we were feeling incredibly cooped up and overwhelmed and frightened, as many people were. And it was during that visit to Louisa May Alcott's, Orchard House, that I really looked at the outside spaces of that house, because we couldn't go in, everything was closed. And I thought more about the context of that house and about the gardens that Alcott writes about, and about Walden Pond that wasn't very far from Orchard House. And I started to have kind of a historical cast of characters that were helping me to see this argument about girlhood's outdoors contributing to women who did daring, courageous things in various walks of life in adulthood. And so I started to have one historical argument that I was seeing that was coming together for this book. And then next to it, there was another argument that was beginning to take shape. And this is an argument that is very familiar in environmental history, but not necessarily so familiar in the history of American girls or history of American women. And that is about the role of the environment in relationship to the role of human culture, human society, political development, and economic changes. Oftentimes, we tend to think that nature and ecology and the natural world is very separate from what human beings do on their own initiative. But of course, that is a false separation. Everything that we as human beings do is interconnected with nature and dependent upon nature. And we have been learning more and more in very disturbing ways, especially as of late, that the things that human beings do as they accumulate over time can actually affect nature and the larger processes of Earth's systems. And so there is a deep interconnection, a deep relationship between human life, human culture, human society, and the natural world. This is an argument that environmental history makes, always wanting to go deeper and deeper to showing the nuances and complexities of that interrelationship. And it's also an argument that I found myself making in Wild Girls, realizing that, as the geologist and earth historian Laurel Thatcher says, everything takes place. Everything that happens occurs in place, she is saying with this comment. And in Wild Girls, I'm adding just another dimension to that, which is that everything takes place, and all places take nature. All places consist of and require the natural world. So putting these ideas together, what I hope to show in the book is that if we go back to the girlhoods, the childhoods of some of these women who are profiled, we can see that, of course, those childhoods took place. They were rooted in and they developed in particular places. And those places were natural. They were also human-made and human-developed because there's no separation, right? But they were also natural in that ecological processes were incredibly important. Geography was incredibly important. What these girls saw in the natural world around them and how they interacted with that natural world and its biotic and abiotic elements was very important to their specific developments. And they, of course, ended up being very important to the development of the nation as a whole. What I hope to do while making these arguments was to also show that nature is not in just one place. Nature is not just of one category. Nature is everywhere and nature is varied. And in addition, I wanted to show that it's not only certain kinds of people who we might typically imagine who are interacting with the natural world. I wanted to show that girls of all different racial backgrounds, all different class backgrounds, all different cultural backgrounds in various places, the places where they lived, did interact with nature. While those relationships were, of course, shaped in accordance with those women's and those girls' social status and their life conditions, they all had that thing in common, that being in place, that relationship with nature. And so I attempted to explore and to demonstrate the commonality and the critical differences when it came to these girls and their upbringing and how they saw the natural world and what they could do in the natural world, what was possible for them there. So in addition to these historical arguments that I was wanting to make or to just kind of buff up a little bit, make it a little more visible through the examination of these girls and their lives, I also wanted to make a cultural contribution of my own through this book. And that contribution was very connected to the moment in which I started working on the book and the time now when it's coming out. When I was first invited to consider writing a book for the Norton Shorts series, which is what Wild Girls is a part of, it's a part of a series of very short books that is intended to celebrate W.W. Norton's 100th anniversary. I wasn't at first sure that I would accept the invitation. The invitation came to me in July. We were all in the thick of trying to understand what COVID-19 was, what COVID-19 could mean for many of us, how it was that we could respond to this, whether or not our society would be up to this. And I really didn't know if this was a book that I should take up next, or if I could even really find the bandwidth to take up this book, because actually my family lost someone. We lost, my children lost a grandparent during COVID, and it was a very difficult time for many people. But the more I thought about it and the more I realized how important outdoor space was during COVID, and the more I watched my family and saw what my family was doing, which was spending time out in the yard when we could do that, going out in nature, taking comfort and listening to the birds, singing outside the house. I realized that I actually did want to write a short book, and I did want to write a short book about girls outdoors, because perhaps thinking through some of these questions about childhood and girlhood and the honing and shaping of lives and the contribution that every person can make, I thought, I want to share this. I want to delve into this and I want to share this and hopefully write a book that could be an inspiration, especially to younger people, especially to girls who might be trying to find their place in the world, as we are all collectively dealing with so many and multiple crises. So the vision I had for this book once I committed to it in my mind, was that it could, in some ways, be a comfort and a bit of company to young people who might consider themselves to be outdoorsy people, and also to young people who didn't think of themselves in that way because they were always told that their kind of outdoors wasn't really nature, such as kids who grow up in the city, like I did. And I imagined these readers maybe being able to take a slim little book, a slim green book, out of their pack while they were walking and just find some solace and find some inspiration and find some company in the stories of historical girls, women of the past, who spent time outdoors and welcomed the outdoors in, or else met their own fiercer selves in an outdoors that was challenging and thereby changed their lives. So to construct this book, I did go back to some women I had already read a bit about, as I mentioned earlier, and I did do some original research, mostly looking at autobiographies, memoirs, the recollections of these women from their childhoods. Sometimes that included looking at letters. It included looking at the memories of family members or people who had observed them or seen them. The research involved, and this was one of my favorite things, going to the historic sites related to the girls and the women in the book and trying to get a better sense of how their lives took place in these natural environments. And then the writing of the book felt to me in some ways like I was putting together almost an album of these various girls who turned into women and who spent time outdoors in a way that changed their lives. So I think of the book as a work that can be read by anyone who loves the outdoors and wants to feel inspired, a work that could be read by college students, by teenagers, a work that could be read in bits and pieces because each chapter is on a different set of women, and I'll go over that a little bit more in just a moment, or a work that could be read straight through in just a few hours. My main purpose in this book was to bring a little bit of inspiration and joy into the lives of readers while also having a realistic framework in the telling of those girls and women's stories. And that will come out a little bit more when I do the reading after my conversation with Professor Ulrich. So now I'd like to just give you a very brief sense of what's going on in each of the chapters. So I want to give you an overview of the 3 chapters in the book, just give you a sense of what I'm doing in each chapter and how I'm trying to bring these girls and women's lives together. The first chapter begins with the woman who I mentioned was really my starting point, and that's Harriet Tubman. It focuses on the period of slavery. It looks at enslaved girls like Harriet Tubman, and it goes into firsthand accounts, as told to accounts and slave narratives, and oral accounts of these girls and by these girls, to try to consider how it is that they grew up in the natural world, how they related to nature, and how they thought about nature. And I think this chapter has many difficult moments, but it also has wonderful revelations about how it is that girls who could be living very, very difficult lives in bondage, girls who were being exploited and who were being abused, could still find a little bit of brightness in the natural world. And in many cases, that brightness came to them from looking up at the sky. So this chapter also talks about Laura Smith Haviland, who was an abolitionist who spent her young womanhood in Michigan, where she became quite radicalized in her opposition to slavery. And as I was going back and trying to consider what girls and women to include in the book, I reread Haviland's memoir and saw that as a girl, she had been very attached to the outdoors. She had walked the streets of her towns and observed what was happening to Black people and how they were being treated. And she had also spent time gazing up at the sky. So chapter 1 looks at slavery and abolitionists, and it looks at the sky quite a lot as a source of questioning and learning and inspiration for all of these girls, across their different statuses and castes in life. Chapter 2 was really inspired by my trip to Orchard House with my kids during COVID. This is an older image of Orchard House, but it looks very much the same way today. You can go visit it in Concord if you haven't already done so, if you're in the area. And I started with Louisa May Alcott for this chapter and found myself thinking quite a lot about her as a writer and how spending time outside as a girl may have sparked her creativity and pushed her to write her most famous and beloved by many book, Little Women, in a particular way that led her to create a protagonist, Jo March, who is absolutely an outdoorsy kind of girl, who is a tomboy kind of girl in the parlance of that period. And as I started thinking about writing through Louisa May Alcott, I brought in more women from the 19th century who became writers, who became intellectuals, and who also had girlhoods that they spent outside and who wrote about the outdoors. I love this image of Alcott's writing desk, and I love to think about how she sat at that desk writing Little Women and looking out at the landscape. So this is another woman who comes into the chapter, which gets started with Louisa May Alcott. This is Anna Julia Cooper, who was an African-American intellectual who was writing, publishing at the turn of the century, and who started an outdoors group for African-American girls in Washington, D.C. So she was somebody who also was committed to the outdoors and who was a writer and a thinker. And in her book, which I discuss in Wild Girls, she talks quite a lot about girls and connects them with nature and talks about how important nature is for the soul of the developing girl. So the third chapter of the book, which is really the last full content chapter of the book, I look at girls who became women who are not nearly as known as the previous girls and women that I've mentioned this evening. And these were Indigenous, which was organized at a federal Indian boarding school. That is a boarding school for Native American children, that Native American children were in many cases compelled to attend. And this particular school was in Montana. Chapter 3 tells the story of these girls on the Fort Shaw basketball team, how they ended up being taken from their reservations or their families pushed to send them from their home reservations. That's a complicated story, and I don't want to gloss over it. I'm happy to go over it more in the Q&A if you'd like. To end up at Fort Shaw, and how Fort Shaw then, through the intervention of an Indigenous girl whose name was Josephine Langley, started a basketball team. This girls' basketball team became quite expert at the sport, which was new at the time and which actually had been developed in Massachusetts. And they ended up playing games all across Montana. They ended up going to the World's Fair in 1904 in St. Louis. And they ended up becoming world champions. I believe the details of that story are for you to explore if you decide to spend some time with the book, or for your children or grandchildren, nieces and nephews to explore if you decide to gift the book to them or take the book out of the library with them. But it is quite a dramatic story about how these Indigenous girls ended up being put in this school, which was actually located on a military base, which I visited during my research, and that was quite an interesting and moving experience. And how they formed this team and regained their strength and and really took on the world. I am going to just stop my overview of the book here and tell you one more story about Professor Ulrich before I hand over the microphone to her for her moderation of our discussion. And this story comes from a really wonderful conference that was held for Professor Ulrich of her work upon her retirement. And I was in the audience, and one of the panelists was a student of Professor Ulrich. And that student said that Laurel Thatcher Ulrich would always tell her about her work. Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds great. Maybe the writing is terrific too. But is it true? So in a moment, I will get to find out if Laurel Thatcher Ulrich thinks my book Wild Girls passes that test. And I really look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Here I am. Okay, so of course it passed the test. I don't know where to start, Tiya. It's really delightful to be here with you, and especially to be able to read your work and then engage in a conversation with you about it. And I have so many things I'd like to ask about. I'm trying to figure out where to begin. But I will start with what for me was the absolute hooker in the book, beautifully done. And I actually handed the book to my husband, who is an engineer who sometimes reads history books and likes them. And I said to him, wow, that preface is amazing. And he said, what preface? It skipped the preface and gone straight to the first section. And I was stunned by the preface and what it did. And I don't know, I'm going to ask you, did you write the preface last or first?
I wrote the preface first.
Wow. Well, you knew where you were going then.
Yes, I think so. I think I knew what the heart of the book.
Well, the heart of the book is in that preface. If any of you have picked up the book and sort of habitually ignore a preface thinking it's not really the beginning, this really is the beginning, because it brings together three things that I think are really remarkable about the book. Memoir and history and the environment. So all three of those things are beautifully realized. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about any one of those things in that chapter. That is, the Ohio River is such a marker historically. I'm sure as you're teaching 19th century history, it is the marker. And do you want to remind people why it is such a marker in 19th century, 18th and 19th century history? Well,
yes. Well, first I want to thank you for reminding me to touch on some of these pieces that begin the book and end the book. And I'll mention too that I read a review recently in which that reviewer really talked about the epilogue. And so you all are talking about the end half of the book.
Exactly. It comes back to the epilogue. Yeah.
Yes. These are both personal
They're
sections of the book.
Yeah.
Yes, they are. Which help to set up and close out the discussion of the historical figures. So this preface really, I hope, captures a sense of when and where I enter this story. And with that, of course, I'm borrowing language from Anna Julia Cooper and the title of her book that I referenced earlier. Because I am one of these people who never really thought of myself as an outdoors kind of person. I never went camping as a kid, and I didn't really think of the time that I spent outside with my family as being nature times or times that anybody might associate with, so like a family taking a trip to a national park. And so when I came to this book project and decided that I would commit to it, I really started to think about, what is my relationship to this? Why is it that I think that a book on historical girls outdoors could actually be inspiring to anybody? What's that connection? And upon reflection, I really did see, in a much more coherent way than snippets of memory had given me previously, that the outdoors had been incredibly inspiring to me, and that spending time in the outdoors is really what made me the person I am. So the book begins with discussing my experiences of the outdoors, including and centrally my experiences with the Ohio River, because I grew up in an Ohio River city, Cincinnati, Ohio, and that river was important to my family in ways that I never really noticed. I mean, my mother would talk about what it was like growing up, on the West End, which is the neighborhood close to the river, and it won't be a surprise to many of you to hear or to be reminded that in many cities, the industrial areas used to be right close to the rivers of those cities, and those were not the desirable places. And so these were the places where poor people ended up, where Black people ended up, where marginalized people ended up. And that was the case for my family once they came north, once my grandmother came north from Mississippi. They built a life in poverty down by the river. And I always knew that. I always heard about that. And as I grew into the first years of my life, my mother and I ended up moving back down by the river after living some other places, because that was where she could afford to buy, her first house, which was a brick row house on the West End. And as a little girl, my father took me and my sister down to the river. My parents hadn't been divorced by then. And he took my sister down there during a very special time when the Ohio River froze over. And this was a rare occurrence. It did not happen very much in the 20th century. It seems to have happened more in the 19th century, though those records weren't kept constantly. So to make that point in the book, I'm relying on some oral accounts. But this was, for me, when I was a little girl of around 7, just an unbelievable thing.
Yeah.
Walking on the river. We actually walked the river, and we got far enough out there that Kentucky was kind of scarily close.
And you'll probably never do. I mean, it's
right.
Forecast, the end of the book, where
right.
we think, where is nature going, and what have we done? But also the political boundary, the boundary between slave and free, the importance as a pathway from east to west. And then, as you so beautifully say, it has no outlet.
When I was growing up, I really did not.
It's a metaphor about community as well. Yes, so just beautiful writing and very moving, and then to think of the amazing story of Margaret Garner and the which is another boundary that you are constantly exploring, is the boundary between history and fiction. And we think of Toni Morrison and what she did with that story. So it really does encapsulate what you do in the book.
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you.
I think it does. I think it's quite there, and then you come back to it in the end and remind us. Okay, now I'm going to ask a little more prosaic question, building on that. I was really intrigued by your discussion, I think in the acknowledgments, although it's mentioned it was mentioned in your biography today, about your founding this group. It was a girls' group, right? Or what?
Yes.
A girls' group. And I remember hearing you talk about your fascination with being on the other end of the Mississippi, I guess, up in the upper Midwest, and the incredible exploration of the history there. But then this program for girls, which seems like an amazing impetus for your book. Could you tell us a little bit more about it and how you did it?
Yes, I can. I'd be happy to do that. I wanted to share too, before I move into talking about Eco Girls, which was the name of that girls group, that what you said was exactly right, Laurel, in terms of the way the Ohio River has so many different symbolic meanings, and how I hope perhaps those meanings begin to echo. And in my own life, those meanings were not all there when I was 7, not at all. I saw Kentucky, but I didn't really know, what it meant when I was 7. It wasn't until I read Toni Morrison, as you mentioned, until I read Beloved as a college student, that I realized the import and the impact of the Ohio River in terms of slavery. So broader than the family context that I mentioned earlier. And later in my life, I ended up working at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And that was a time when another river, a different river, became very visible and salient and important. And that was the Detroit River. Both of these rivers, the Ohio and the Detroit, were geographical markers, geopolitical markers. They were international boundaries and borders. And they were both barriers and highways, in a sense, that enslaved people needed to be aware of, work with, and move across if they wanted to try to attain their freedom. It was in Michigan, near another river, actually more than one. In Ann Arbor was the Huron River, so many wonderful rivers, that I started Eco Girls. And this was a community-facing project that I got some grant funding for, which was focused on environmental education for girls in southeastern Michigan. And these were girls in urban areas, especially Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, and Detroit. We also had some girls who were in the program from Saline. My hope with that program was, really to do, I'm realizing this as we're talking, really to do on the ground what the book Wild Girls is wanting to do with readers' thinking and imaginations. And that is, I wanted to help these girls in the program to see and experience that their lives were unfolding in a place full of vibrancy, full of life, full of all kinds of elements and features and creatures that they could interact with and be with. And I wanted them to learn and to experience that this place was theirs. This was their place. And this was a wonderfully wild place in many ways and in all facets, whether or not they were growing up on a tight city street or growing up in a suburban area where they had a big yard. One of the stories that I remember and I love about the Eco Girls program is we would take the girls out on outings on the weekends. We also had a summer camp. And on one of our outings, we went to the Detroit River, of course, we went to Belle Isle, this very large island park, and we went to a shipping museum on Belle Isle, and there was a storyteller who was supposed to come, a local storyteller who was supposed to come and tell us about Detroit, and she ended up not being able to make it. So I found myself, with all these kids sitting on the grass on Belle Isle, thinking, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do here? And I telling a story about the Detroit Underground Railroad. We could see the river. We could see the river, Laurel. It was right there we were sitting. And so I started. So nature became my cue, and I started telling a story about the Detroit Underground Railroad, and a woman who played a role in helping to free this couple who made it across the river. And I looked out on these faces, and these girls were just looking at me with rapt attention and such excitement and enthusiasm, because that was their river. This was their home. And they had heard a story about what was possible and how freedom could be made possible. People dared to imagine a life beyond the constraints that society was placing on them.
Yeah.
So that's a story I remember. I just love it. When I tell it, I think back to that day and how wonderful it was to realize that.
Amazing. Yeah. So you're moving on and finding yourself doing some of the things that the people you wrote about were doing, empowering another generation by finding meaning and also by creating words and stories and history that are accessible and readable and relatable for them. So do you think of this do you think of your readers of this book as girls?
Well, I tried to do something in this book that was kind of challenging. I wanted it to be accessible, as you say, but I also wanted to kind of sneak in some historical complexity, to sneak in some context and nuance. I wanted to try to layer what it was that I was telling, so that readers could see that, okay, this happened in this period, but that was only possible because of what happened 100 years before. And so I definitely had a pedagogical intention with this book. I wanted it to be readable, but also sneakily informative for young readers. And by young readers, I don't mean children, though I think children could read the book.
Teens.
But yes, teens, college students.
Yeah.
That's who I'm thinking about, the girls in the Eco Girls program, who are by this time in their teens and in their young, 20s, as my ideal readers. I just imagined them reading the book.
Here's a theme that interests me quite a lot in the book. You talk about outdoors and you talk about nature, but you kind of trick us a bit as readers, because I think, we think of the Audubon Society or we think of, national park or going camping. But then you tell us stories about outdoors that are quite different from that. I mean, including some of your own stories about going to a vacant lot, finding things in your backyard. And then as you move on to the book, political demonstrations, strikes, going outdoors to make a point about your rights or your position in society. So you broaden the concept. It's outdoors. It's not necessarily the way we normally talk about outdoors. It's the way we talk about it in terms of nature study. Absolutely, it's that. But it's more than that. And it's about, what is it about? Is it about the body? Is it about boundaries?
Well,
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you reconceptualize that notion of being out?
Well, this was one of my ulterior motives in the book. Maybe it's actually quite plain.
Okay.
And that was to really have an opportunity to expand on an argument that I made in an opinion piece that appeared in the New York Times. I think it came out in 2019, and it was titled Black Bodies, Green Spaces. And that was a piece which was an overview of African American history in the context of environmental history or environmental surrounds, which was wanting to say that Black people have lived in and worked with and shaped and been shaped by environments and the so-called, quote, natural worlds, just as much as any other population, but that the more common kind of general image of Black people tends to be enslaved people picking cotton in the South.
Yeah.
And of course, this did happen. This is a part of the story, but it's not all that happened. It's not the only way that Black people have related to the outdoors. And even within that scene, if we were to freeze the scene of Black people picking cotton in the South, and if we were to go into their reminiscences and their experiences, we would see there was much more of a fine-grained relationship that they had to those outdoor places, even if they were exploitative contexts, than what that quick image would suggest.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this book, I wanted to kind of break up and differentiate the picture of what's outdoors and who can be there, and to show that every population has experiences outdoors that are valuable to them, and that are sometimes not so visible to people outside their group, and that we need to slow down, redefine what we think of as the outdoors, and look at the firsthand accounts, the very close-up representations of these outdoor experiences, to get a fuller picture and a fuller sense of how it is that these various groups experience the outdoors. And if we do that, we not only respect these groups, respect their histories, and end up with a fuller picture of U.S. history, but we also might just find some nuggets, some insights that we can apply to our problems right now when it comes to environmental issues and environmental crises. That some of these groups who have been viewed as not really having a relationship to nature that's worth pausing and thinking about actually have insights about nature that can be very valuable to all of us. And so the book is attempting to expand this argument about who is in green spaces, quote, green spaces, and also, as you tucked into your question, Laurel, to expand the idea of what a green space even is, to help us to see that a vacant lot is outdoors. So, for example, when I talked about Laura Smith Haviland, I tried to sneak into my little quick chapter overview that her outdoors was not just about sitting around in gardens, so that's a beautiful, wonderful thing to do.
Yeah.
Her outdoors was actually walking the streets of her town in New York State and observing what was happening in human relationships. That's outdoors as well. And so when we think about the multiplicity of outdoors, we have so many different arenas in which to consider these diverse histories and the ways in which people have really seen their lives and seen their interactions, seen their relationships in ways that can be informative for us.
So in a way, you start with Alcott and the cult of true womanhood. The idea that women are frilly things and they belong in the parlor and they're very polite and et cetera, et cetera. And she pushes that boundary. But as we move through the book, there are other kinds of boundaries being pushed.
Yes.
And so it becomes a really interesting metaphor, including very rich material. And it's very subtle. I mean, you're not hitting us over the head with it, but it's really about a multiracial definition of abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights more broadly. It's about a coming together of people from different places to interact and, as you say on the cover, make a difference in the world. At least that's the way I read it.
Yes, I appreciate that read. I love what you said about with the example of Alcott. She's pushing boundaries, as a girl outdoors, and then over the course of the pages where I'm trying to tell her story and bring in the stories of other girls and women, I'm showing how more and more boundaries are being pushed. And that's exactly what I am trying to do. I'm so glad you see that.
I think that
let me just give one example from Alcott. I wanted to give one example from Alcott's childhood that I think illustrates this, Laurel, which is that she ran away a lot as a kid. She was very curious and didn't like being shut up and closed in. And she would often go to the Boston Common when she was a small child, Alcott would. And once when she was there, she fell into a pond. She calls it a frog pond in her reminiscences. And it was a black who got her out and who rescued her. And her mother attributes that moment to when she became an abolitionist. So, of course, she was very young and her political views weren't formed yet. But it is being outside without the same kinds of barriers and boundaries that would have kept her apart from the Black boy.
And
landing in a pond in a totally unexpected situation that let her have a new relationship with a category of person that she couldn't have predicted and that we couldn't have predicted. That happened outside, and one of the implicit arguments of the book is that kind of thing is more likely to happen outside of walls and outside of the surveillance and supervision of authority figures.
Basketball. Have you seen the basketball costumes at Schlesinger? The women's.
No.
Oh, well, I'll have to email you and tell you about that. They're absolutely amazing.
I bet they are. I should have done that. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll send you a personal note about that. But I because you started with Tubman and then ended with basketball and the wonderful group of women who ended up at the St. Louis World's Fair, I was thinking about bloomers because I've written about that a little bit and tangible things, the book that I wrote about Harvard.
Yes. Right there on my shelf.
And I think if I'm not mistaken, Harriet Tubman, and I really wonder if it was tongue-in-cheek, apparently, when she's down working on the Combahee River assault, she sends this message. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Saying, ladies, send me bloomers. My clothes are getting ragged. But that notion of clothing as part of the story that you're telling. I want to ask a little bit tougher question here about that third chapter, which I loved and was wonderful to read about. Right now, we're hearing a lot of horror stories about those schools that take children away from their parents, or did tremendously into the 20th century. I remember knowing about these schools, kids being taken away from their reservations in the Southwest and coming up to some kind of government-run school. And yet your chapter, it tells an essentially happy story. And that's interesting. And so talk about that a little bit.
I will. So you, of course, being you, found the tension in that chapter immediately. That's a tension that I felt when I was writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tension that moves all through the book.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it might be most kind of emphatic in that last chapter. Mm-hmm. It's a tension around these negative contexts that many of the girls and women that I write about are living within, and the ways in which they still were able to find spaces of respite, moments of joy, feelings of connection. So the last chapter is about this girls' basketball team. And most of the chapter, I think, I hope, has the combination of the spirit of these girls were finding each other, finding a passion, becoming really good at the sport, so gaining skills and accomplishing something that nobody ever thought they could accomplish, including themselves. So that's one part. So a part of this chapter, which is about the context in which they are doing this, and the reason why they have to do this. Part of the reason why forming this team is so important to them is that they have been pulled away from their families, and they are in a new institution, which is a very restrictive kind of institution, which did all the kinds of things that we know that boarding schools did that were common. So having the kids, when they come in, they had to have their hair cut. They weren't allowed to speak their Indigenous languages. They weren't even allowed to speak to each other in many instances in the school. They had to, walk in these military-like lines. If they broke the rules, they were punished in all kinds of ways, from having to do extra work to actually being shut up in the jail on the campus. And this context of, it's kind of the shadow is always there in the chapter, and it's the reason why it's part of the propulsion for the girls' movement. They have each other and they have an outlet, and they actually get to travel away from this campus, which is kind of like a prison-like environment. So as I told this and wrote this, I really did revise this chapter a few times, and I had to really think about exactly the question you asked me, which is, how do I want to tell this story? I knew that I wanted the story to have this sense of energy and momentum and the forward movement and positivity, because I wanted to emphasize what these girls had accomplished, and I wanted to show that although terrible things were being done to their people as a part of the American process of very violent colonization, they still survived that. And one of the ways they survived it was by being outside and moving their bodies and learning a new sport and having fun together and learning what it was that they were capable of.
Yeah. Well, I think the joy and happiness that came through, and the difficulty as well. And we haven't. Yes, it's this catch-22 about history in general and about history of racism and sexism. I mean, people sometimes, people survive and then change things in part by the way they do that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for these questions, everybody. The first question is about how wildness is appearing in the book and what this metaphor is doing in the book. So this is tricky, of course, and it's tricky in similar ways to what we were just talking about in terms of a context of coercion and exploitation, but also people having their own lives that they try to live within those constraints. So wildness is a notion that has often been used in negative ways to refer to certain populations. So if a woman was described as wild in the period that this book is mostly concentrated in, that would not have been a good thing. And so to be wild would be a negative trait. It would mean that you were not living up to these standards of Victorian womanhood that Professor Ulrich mentioned earlier. Now, there is an exception for Native American women. That exception is also very stereotypical, and it's also demeaning. Native women, in many cases, were expected to be wild, but in a way that was quite racist. So what wildness is doing for me in this book is it's allowing me to try to recover that word, to recover the sense that to be wild can also mean being free to express yourself, to explore, and especially really to think and to move, to think for yourself, to move your body in ways that girls, even in their different castes and racial backgrounds and class positions, were being discouraged from doing. So the wildness actually is something that I was writing about in the draft. It kept coming up. I was seeing it in the language of these women, or in the language of people who were describing them, people from their families who had known them. And I was seeing it in their academic writings. Some of the Native women that I write about were scholars. It really took my editor to say, wait a minute, Wild Girl should be the title of this book. It took my editor to say, I see this theme, and this theme really does, kind of encompass and frame what the book is trying to do with recognizing that these girls were bold enough to be wild, in a sense. And I'm trying to reclaim that word. Piggyback onto that answer, another answer to a question of did the women in the book acknowledge and address nature and what the outdoors meant to them? Yes, they did. They did many times and in many ways, through poetry, through expository writing, through fiction. They were always doing it, but I, as a reader and scholar, just didn't notice that they were doing it until I went back to their writings with this concept in mind.
Well, that is just a beautiful place to move on. And I really thank you both for sharing. One of you said a fuller history of America, and taking us really to and then through so many boundaries, history, environment, and memoir, and post-racial, ideally post-sexism, but clearly not, because this book exists and it's so important. We thank you. And as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration series, we've asked Professor Miles to read from her book. So Professor, back to you for this wonderful brief reading.
Thank you. So I'm going to read just a few paragraphs from the introduction, which is titled Wayfinders. From the micro scale of a single tree to the macro scale of the forest, spaces in nature have been meaningful to the visionary lives of American girls. Girl outsiders became trailblazers in their communities and American culture writ large. Time in the outdoors ignited girls' critical awareness, fed their self-knowledge, charged moments of inner peace that steadied their spirits in tumultuous times. The stories press into this book like wildflower petals, will show how time spent outside shaped the character of girls who later changed the country. Being outdoors permitted girls, consigned to cloistered domestic and ideological space, a means to experience freedom of physical movement, to escape adult surveillance, and to explore beyond gendered societal dictates. A space to discover who they were and what they were capable of. This relative license fueled girls' sense of self-definition and potential. While this book proposes that the out-of-doors lit girls' imaginations, tested their talents, and readied them for social courage and political action, it also portrays outside as a dual and even dialectical space where brightness joined darkness, wonder met worry, and exploration was tethered to danger. The history of girls outdoors, especially girls of color, reveals a persistent shadow side where labor exploitation and physical danger haunted daily life. I offer this work not only as a foray into the past world of American girls, the meanings they made outside, but also as a field guide for any watchful reader who tracks the stars and wonders with a quixotic mix of audacity and awe where those faint lights might lead. History tells us that change is possible when people find ways through the fog. The trail is calling. Are you ready?
Thank you so much, Professor Miles. And yes, we are ready. We feel empowered by tonight, and we're grateful to you and also to Professor Ulrich for making us aware and pointing us to really our common cause as women particularly. So thank you so much for that.